In this episode, filmed on location in Kathmandu, Nepal, I am joined by Jina Kusala, originally from Norway, now a wandering Theravada monk. Jina tells the story of his traumatic childhood, the mental suffering and instability it caused, and how the Buddhist path provided a means to reckon with the pain. Jina shares encounters with religious leaders such as Mingyur Rinpoche, recalls meeting previous podcast guest Bhante Jason, and reflects on the profound time he spent under Bhante's instruction. Jina also recounts his Himalayan wanderings and cave retreats, discusses the power of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, details the differences between Hīnayāna and Vajrayāna realisations, and explains why with incremental progress one may aim for sainthood. So without further ado, Jina Kusala.
My name's Jina Kusala, Theravada monk from Norway originally. Ordained in Sri Lanka, but originally from the frigid countries of Norway, and now in Kathmandu for the time being.
And how long have you been in Kathmandu?
About 2 weeks. Been a bit of a contrast from about 5 months in the mountains, the Annapurna region. So it's helpful to see the mind in different contexts, sometimes pendulating between extremes, so that you see yourself from both sides. So if clinging too much to ideal circumstances, then the mind vexes whenever anything unpleasant comes its way. And so a certain amount of voluntary exposure to that which, let's say, goes against your ideal can be very helpful. Kind of gratitude for the vexing aspects of life.
What kind of vexing aspects have you been having these last 6 months?
Well, mostly my own mind. It's not really the problem of the world, but problem of perspective and attitude. So if one creates a like, then by that means there is also dislikes, and it's a training to move beyond both. Also knowing that there's certain kinds of likes that lead to your development and growth as an individual. So those you have to hold on to, which means path always has some level of struggle.
So tell me, Jina, you were born in Norway and you grew up there. Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood and the early stages of your life?
Well, my parents are probably going to listen to this, but I'll speak to the extent that I can. Probably, I think, up until about 3 years old, very good. And quite close to my mother. But then, due to family circumstances, then everything kind of flipped upside down. And then a lot of fighting for 3 years. Seemingly, I think, I don't directly remember much of it. Usually that's the case with trauma, but I have certainly felt the effects of that the last 4 years, and like parts of the psyche that are just kind of broken and fractured, and then having to enter, let's say, states of being internally that are like 3 years old, and then having to learn to nurture that until it's no longer in a withered and broken state. So probably I think trauma is among the worst kinds of suffering that a human being can go through. When you start, let's say, opening up the scar tissue and entering into territory where you also lose your previous functionality. Kind of your normal way of functioning in your entire world just kind of stops, and you can't engage in it. And then the same time, then you have to learn how to heal and nurture, like a mother and father, those aspects of yourself, which is quite difficult. There's a book called Radical Compassion by Tara Brach. It's probably one of the most helpful meditation tools for such things. I would greatly recommend. If I hadn't found that, then I would be, I mean, probably either have died or maybe killed myself, something like that. It's quite intense to go through. But I'm very grateful for having stumbled upon tools that I could use to heal myself, basically. Ideally, if you have been traumatized, then hopefully you find a person that can help and heal you. But it's a very tricky thing to navigate when at the same time there are so many walls of distrust. So then my particular way of dealing with was solitude a lot. So then found that easier way to heal.
What sort of trauma are you talking about here?
Early childhood trauma in the sense of complete breakage of trust and sanity in the family. So that was it's kind of like those states of mind is kind of like being entrapped in a kind of inner hell where anything can happen at any time. So that's not very fun. But it's also one of the greatest blessings in some sense. As they say, the deeper in the depths of suffering that you traverse, if you are able to redeem it and heal it, then over time, then you become a vessel of transformation for others who have similar wounds. And so in that sense, in the long run, it's a meaningful thing. So all such things have their good sides if you take them rightly.
When was it you became interested in Buddhism?
Well, I realized that the ways in which my mind hoped and longed for happiness within external means didn't work. That things like travel, enjoyment, trekking, these things are wholesome activities, but or wholesome or not depends on your attitude. But they don't have any inherent lasting satisfaction. They're subject to something like a potato chip effect, that if you eat it, then in the beginning it's very satisfying to the tongue, but with every chip you take, then the taste diminishes until you're left with a barren, ridden taste that no longer satisfying, even maybe slightly painful. and then like, the mind's tendency is then to keep on going by maybe switching to another object like chocolate. And so this mechanism of finding happiness by external means works quite like this, is that, well, you make up a dream or a fantasy of, oh, if I get to do this or drink margaritas on the beach, then somehow I'll be happy. And then you go there and then, oh yeah, it's happy for a while, but then you get sick of it. And then you have to, then the mind dreams up something else just to keep itself going. And then you just kind of loop around from activity to activity. And then you never really get to happiness. Instead, your default state becomes more unhappy, because the more that you externalize satisfaction and happiness, then the more your inner default state is that of being unhappy and dissatisfied. The very assumption that happiness is to be found externally, by that very assumption, then you've created a dualism where happiness is outside, and by that contrast, unhappiness is inside. And then the force between them then starts craving, the thirst of wanting something, feeling the need to do something, distract yourself, not be with yourself, disliking the present moment. And so that's the kind of miniature samsara. Samsara in the sense of wandering on and looping around.
So you left home and went trekking. Is that what you're telling me? And then you got involved in Buddhism.
Yeah.
So what's the biographical stage during your teenage years?
I just finished high school, and then I thought, wow, if I get to travel and then have freedom, and then somehow I'll be happy in life. I sort of pictured myself like some kind of vagabond, which I kind of am right now, but but I thought that in itself would be a means of appeasement of life. And I quickly realized that no matter how many beautiful mountains you see, then there's only so many days that you can see them and find them, let's say, avenues for appeasement and satisfaction. They're still the same mountains, still beautiful, but the mind is always, let's say, always has this, Buddha called it tatra abhinandini. So it's tatra again and again, they're lighting in this and that. So try to gain satisfaction from this thing, then that thing, and then it just goes on and on. So that by means of travel, that the mechanism of desire and wanting happiness in the external world is broken. And that if you try to make a fantasy that you think will make you happy, then it'll throw you up on the other side somewhere in life where you're barren, dissatisfied, hopeless. And so the way that most people, let's say the average person, counteracts that is by means of something meaningful and also responsibility. So in some sense, the reality of having to work and sacrifice for the sake of monetary gain, things like that, although a painful reality is also what keeps people afloat, because it gives them some sense of meaning and purpose and responsibility. So oftentimes if people go jobless, then they often become quite depressed. So there are, let's say, pleasures in life that are worthwhile, that which is meaningful, that which leads to your development. So those things are to be, let's say, held on to. Otherwise, then, well, you need some kind of raft within going through life, because it's so difficult. Then you need meaning to justify it. But ultimately, in the Buddhist path, then, so one uses meaningful things and lifestyle and activities as a means of developing the individual such that it has a basis, a firm foundation in ethics and virtue, and from there one starts to discern the difference between wholesome and unwholesome, and then the root of the unwholesome, which is assumption of externalized fantastical happiness. And then when you cut through that, then you seize the rivers of craving, you seize the rivers of attraction and aversion and longing, and then the lost personal and personalizing mind is extinguished, and that's, let's say, a taste of what Nibbana would be like.
When did you first encounter Buddhism and Buddhist practitioners?
Real first encounter was at a small forest monastery in Norway, lineage of Ajahn Chah. So that's where I kind of first started collecting up books, things like that. That was after my initial travels, and then I was very hungry for any kind of wisdom or understanding about the nature of life and of the mind. Then gradually I went to Sri Lanka. For some reason quite drawn to that country, and visited various monasteries and explored it a lot, and tried to meditate. And then gradually having to face up to all the underlying emotion that were kind of welling up within my mind. And so that started its own kind of journey of just constantly having to process and deal with a constant arising of emotional suffering. That didn't really allow me to do anything else for a while, the last 4.5 years. So, but it's been a good teacher. When inherently you're unable to get what you like and control the world as you want, then it's very easy to let go. Yeah, we should move to another location now, I think.
Where did you meet Bhante Jason?
Oh, let's see. Well, at first, I think about 3 years ago in Sri Lanka. And so he was a very good, like a very special monk in that among all my attempts of finding someone that could try to help me, then he was one of those people that who understood to a good extent and whose advice was very helpful. So I really appreciate having met him. He has a very, sophisticated maybe, mm-hmm. or quite an advanced understanding of early Buddhist practice and meditation, and his instructions are quite they're very practical and very helpful, and they're kind of, well, in brief, it's learning how to use the 4 satipatthanas, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and then working with them all at the same time and regarding them more like energy, such that you can then transform and mold them towards more harmony and integration. And then utilizing the breath in all of that. So it's quite different from how Buddhist practice is taught nowadays, where nowadays then first, the four foundations of mindfulness is either thought like you just focus on the body, and then, or you just focus on feeling, or you just focus on chitta, or the emotional mind. But if you do all of them at the same time, and then focus on particular ones according to the needs, then you start to, well, you see the whole platform from which you function, which is body, feeling, sensation, emotion, and thinking. And if you can bring awareness to all of them, then you have much more control over your action and reaction with regards to the world. And then once you bring awareness to that, then you can start to guide it towards the direction of wholesomeness. That which is, let's say, more effective, more integrated, more aligned with the principles of Dhamma. And as you do that, well, first of all, the awareness, when that gathers internally, then the mind stops being distracted and scattered. So it starts being unified. And that in itself starts making the mind meditative in a much more easier way than, let's say, if you were just to focus very tightly on your breath. Because if the mind and awareness permeates the body, then it naturally becomes unified by the fact that mind and body are interconnected phenomena. There are certain faculties of mind, let's say thinking is in the head, certain faculties in the throat, emotions of the heart, the bodily intelligence of the gut. So if you then unify awareness with the body, then you access you also unify with those faculties much more effectively. And as awareness permeates the body, then it naturally becomes more relaxed. And when it becomes more relaxed, then you say that like in an electrical circuit, when there's a resistance or resistor, then naturally there'll be a buildup of tension. It's like voltage. But if you relax away the resistance and the tension, then your body and mind starts acting like a superconductor, and then that's the basis for jhānas, where the body and mind starts generating on its own its internal bliss and joy, based upon simply the unification. And from there, you deepen the harmony and the subtlety, and then learn how to pervade that to different parts of your body, and thereby clear out your emotional blockages, energetic blockages. And from there, you can direct the mind very effectively towards insight, where you see how bodily and mental phenomena arise on their own without your control, cease on their own without your control, and their coming and going happens on their own without your control. So when you cut through the assumptions of a controller and a center point, then the whirlpool of an assumed center point and self is then let go of. And then you're no longer distorting reality and taking something as me and mine. And then in that shedding of self, in that letting go, then the unconditioned is discerned. So that's a Buddhist path in brief. How one would develop samadhi by means of the four foundations of mindfulness: body, feeling, sensation, emotion, and thinking. Mastering that, harmonizing that, then using that harmony to cut through distortion of vision and delusion. Primarily, delusions are of three kinds. Delusions of constancy and permanence, delusions of inherent happiness and satisfaction, and delusions of control and self. That's the anicca, the dukkha, anatta. So one may contemplate on any of those three according to one's, let's say, individual inclination. The purpose of that is to fulfill the function of the Four Noble Truths. As a fundamental truth of life is that it's very difficult and it's bounded by suffering. So if you don't do things, if you don't maintain, let's say, your body, then you're subject to sickness and poor health. If you don't, let's say, maintain your relationships, your family, your work, then no matter what, you run into problems. And so default state is that things fall apart and you're always bound by having to do something in order for things not to go horribly wrong. And so therefore, fundamentally, life has a characteristic of suffering. At times one may, even for long periods of time, one may seem as if one is living in heaven and walking on clouds, but everyone knows that that doesn't last forever, and everyone knows that mortality is inevitable, that illness is inevitable. And so if something is inevitable, then it's as if it's already there in some sense. And the second of the truths is that the cause is once, say, the Pali word is tanha, usually translated as craving, but better understood as affixment, expectation, attachment, and attraction and aversion. So by creating preference, like and dislike, then that duality binds you by separating out that which you delight in and then automatically creating an opposite which you dislike. And so it's like if you have a pane of glass or a window that has a crack in it, the degree to which you delight in a perfect window is the degree to which your mind will be upset by the crack in the window. So only problem with life that is always a crack in the window. There's always something that's slightly off. So seeing that clearly and looking it in the eye, then you get to the third truth, which is the cessation of suffering lies in the letting go, the relinquishment of attachment, and the dispassion of passion and desire. But that's not to mean that one doesn't use desire for skillful means. Use it for generating motivation to develop character. But it's always, desire has this nature of having a wholesome part and an unwholesome part, and then depending on to what degree you've developed yourself, then what is unwholesome is always like a scale. That as you keep moving on, then what is unwholesome becomes more and more clear, and then you start shedding that. So by contemplating impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, also inherent struggle, and uncontrollableness, then the mind lets go. And when it lets go, then things are allowed to be as they are. And so an interesting process happens where if you had a forest pool or a forest lake that was permeated by waves and ripples due to the winds perturbing the waters, then the mind, when it lets go, is like that lake coming to stillness. And so what occurs is a kind of cooling down of mind, and it no longer gets perturbed by agreeable or disagreeable contact and experience, and thereby in some way stainless or rustless, unreactive. And it's that unreactive state where grasping has been let go of, the magnetic attraction and aversion has been stilled, where the waters become so clear that, if you've ever seen this, where it's so still that the reflection of the upside world is entirely similar to the actuality, and the surface is non-discernible. And in the same way, the mind stilled from clinging, from grasping, and from distorted assumptions of control becomes stilled in such a way that the empty, unconditioned element becomes discernible. And that would be Nibbana.
How long were you with Bhante Jason, and how did that time come to an end?
Let's see. I was with him for a few days, starting 3 years ago, and then I came back to him about 1.5 years ago, and then stayed a few months at his hermitage so that I could kind of heal my mind. So that was one of the most helpful periods of my life. So he had some very helpful instruction, and also was a very good example of how a monk life could be lived. So then after that, I went to a nearby monastery and ordained there. So that was separate from his hermitage. So that was mostly our, let's say, separation for some time. And later on, then with the adjustment of becoming a monk and still having a slightly, let's say, volatile emotional nature that still needed a lot of healing, then eventually I felt like I needed to find some kind of solution, as it was too tricky to say meditate and thereby energize the body and mind, and then go through cycles of kind of purging, and then at the same time being within the Sangha was very, normally it shouldn't be a problem, but with a partially broken mind is quite difficult. So I eventually left that monastery and then tried to look for someone in Sri Lanka that maybe had some kind of super ability of understanding, but I didn't find that, so then just ended up doing things on my own, which worked very well, actually. So in the process of leaving the monastery, then how usually you end up doing things, and how usually things end up in life that one inadvertently ends up hurting one another, even though one doesn't wish it. So then a bit of a painful break with Bhante Jason, that I didn't want to be like that. But that will sort itself out.
So how long have you been ordained?
Oh, not very long. Oh, 1.5 years.
And can you say something about this broken mind and what its symptoms were and how it was you went about dealing with it? You told me earlier that, off camera, that it's really only in the last 4 months that you've turned a corner in that.
Last 6 months, then becoming very functional. More functional than I could imagine. But before then, whenever I sit down, then my mind starts generating a lot of energy and kind of, some people maybe call it like a kind of kundalini. It's a complicated term because there's so many associations that are not entirely to the truth. It's more like, say, due to maybe some past merit or something like that. And some people are subject to certain expansions of consciousness that just happen by themselves and have their own momentum that you can't stop. And the unfoldment of that, together with traumas and various emotional blockages, it leads to a very, let's say, very painful evolution where you end up purging all of that comes to the surface, and you don't have much control when it comes to the surface and to the degree to which it comes to the surface. And so it's like you go through these kind of cycles of increased energy and consciousness, and then you crash down and enter into the state of mind of your traumas, and then you have to kind of clamber through them and heal them in whatever way that you can manage, while being severely dysfunctional with regards to other people and just very normal things like doing chores or things like that, and quite reduced health. And then after getting through a period of that, which maybe lasts a day or a few days or maybe a week, then process repeats. And so that's not a fun process to go through, because any kind of human depends upon a level of certainty every kind of human depends on a level of certainty and predictableness of their life. But if all that is chaos, and then you don't even know if you will function the next day or if later in the day, then you will suffer enormously because you happen to eat a little bit of weed or something that you're intolerant to, which previously was fine. Then that kind of uncertainty, it'll make most people go insane by itself, because you can't predict anything, and you also can't predict if whether or not your relationships with other people are going to work harmoniously or not, or you just bump into their shadows. Then it's like you're alone entirely in existence, and that's literally like being broken, because you also can't get out of it. that unfoldment will just keep on going until it's done. And it's pretty horrible to go through. So yeah, it wasn't until about 7 months ago where things stabilized to the extent where I didn't have any health problems anymore, and that I could handle people effectively and deal with the world without being overwhelmed. So that was at the time when I first came to Nepal. And since then, things have been going very well.
What were some of the interpersonal challenges? You talked about difficulties in relationships. How did that manifest itself?
Ooh. Well, every kind of relationship with another person, you're using the perceptual structure of the relationship between your mother and father through your childhood. And so if that's broken, then you don't have a perceptual structure to relate to other people in a way that doesn't go wrong in some way eventually, even though you don't want to. So what happens is, so all your wounds and distrust will automatically project itself, and at least in my case, it made me unable to kind of connect with anyone, and also be, or to a large part, unable to, let's say, heal through anyone, because my mind was projecting the same situation as from before to the current situation, and thereby I felt fundamentally somehow misunderstood, and that this person wasn't trustworthy, things like that. And so then, no matter their best intentions, even though they may have understood, then I couldn't access that reality. And one also tends to manifest, one's unprocessed trauma tends to manifest itself as making similar situations in life play themselves out, even though you had no intention of it happening. So that means kind of bumping into people's shadows unexpectedly, and then often being hurt by that. But if in a way, then that's a good thing, because if you can absorb other people's shadows, then maybe you can heal them too. So sort of constantly having to bump into the dark sides of life and people, eventually I saw as quite a beneficial thing, because if you can become a vessel that happily and gladly absorbs people's darkness, then what happens is that, well, if you voluntarily take something on, then you become immune to it, and then you also become a cure to it. And I found a lot of meaning in, say, opening up those gates to the shadow and then allowing that to, say, nullify itself within me, so that it doesn't need to go through anyone else. So that's some of the benefits I've found within the Himalayan Buddhism, in that it's basically the epitome of Jungian shadow work in some ways. So the deities depicted, although unconventional and certainly quite upside down in some ways, is a very effective means of taking the evil and darkness of the world onto yourself and transforming it into something fragrant and beautiful. So I found a lot of benefit in being in Nepal and the Himalayas just for that reason.
Have you engaged in practices involving those deities? How have you managed to access that insight that you're describing now?
Well, I think it seems I have quite a lot of karmic background in that tradition. Up in the Himalayas, oftentimes in many places and caves would enter upon memories of having been in that place. And although I've never really had any teacher in that tradition, nor received any initiation in it, then I found that those things arose inside on their own, and that it's a very effective means of healing, and very effective means to transform one's perspective to be able to deal with the vicissitudes of life when it throws things at you. So for that I appreciate that tradition. But also it's important to understand that the later developments of Buddhism doesn't lead to the same liberation that one finds in early Buddhism. So things like clear light and Rigpa and the evolvement of, let's say, Shunyata within Mahayana, those states are not the same as Nibbana. This often happens is that one may experience the arupa samadhis, so that is infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception, and they can be experienced as non-dual states, not like absorptions, but something like that permeates the backgrounds of your experience. And since they're so formless, then they seem the same as nirvana. So what happened through the unfoldment of Buddhism is that, let's say, quite charismatic individuals would, let's say, experience those states and stabilize in them, and then they would start to teach them. And then, since they're so almost indiscernible indifference from Nibbana, then so naturally then, let's say, the traditions evolve to aim differently. One can prove this by the fact that, let's say, in the Vajrayāna tradition, for all this goodness and helpful ways of transforming the mind, even, let's say, highly attained practitioners, when they die, they often look for their reincarnation. But if someone had truly attained to arahantship or nirvana, then they wouldn't be able to find their reincarnation. So something is going on, and there's certainly a difference in the attainment and the quality of consciousness there, which is important to understand for any kind of spiritual practitioners, because certainly if one is interested in meditation, then, well, there are karmic causes for that, and one may be, let's say, one may have past merit in these kinds of formless states, these formless non-dual states, and often people have awakenings where they just spontaneously experience those states. And it's important to understand the distinction between what is a formless non-dual state and what is the cessation of clinging and grasping and the controlling mind. Otherwise, then, and this even happens in the Thai forest tradition, where they do practice for nibbana, but they also have this thing called puru, which is like the knowing, which is the same as what's called as vijnana and chayatana, the sphere of infinite consciousness. So if you become aware of that which knows, that which is aware of experience, and that which knows thought itself, and then you deepen into that, then that will open up that formless non-dual dimension. And even practitioners within the Thai forest tradition often mistake that state for nibbana itself, which is unfortunate. So it's an important distinction, and one that I think any kind of practitioner needs to be aware of, that yes, you can experience very profound non-dual states, and those things are helpful, but shouldn't be taken as the end. The end should instead be understood as the extinction of mental defilement, where you're no longer able to act out of evil intentions, where your mind is no longer endarkened, and you're unable to suffer in the circumstances which previously made your mind shake. That's a better measurement. So in early Buddhist thought, then enlightenment isn't the best word either, because often, well, you have great experiences of samadhi and brightness of mind, but those states are usually impermanent. So it better understood in terms of release and liberation. And in early Buddhist thought, liberation is synonymous with what's called as asava kaya. Asava is defiled mental flows, and kaya is the destruction and removal of that. So if one is freed from asava, when the mind doesn't have any defiled mental flows at all, no corruption, no darkness, no deception, and it's unable to be shaken or enter into that in any circumstance, that would be liberation.
So I understand when you came to Nepal, you met with Mingyur Rinpoche and received some advice from him, some travel advice at the very least. And so I'm curious what that was about, and also what your plans are for the following months.
Well, when I first came to Nepal, I thought, let me just go to some monasteries here in Kathmandu, and then I'll ask around for a good place to retreat. And I first came here to Bauda, and then somehow by happenstance, I didn't really plan to. I ended up near Swayambhu, and then I thought, oh, well, here's the monastery of Mingyur Rinpoche, let me just go there and see. I thought it unlikely that I would meet him because it was quite busy. And even when I came there, then there was this big event going on, this Drupchen, and so even still quite unlikely, but somehow he found time a little bit, so then he recommended I go up to Manang in the Annapurnas, and I had trekked through that region 5.5 years before, so then I thought, well, that's a good idea, and then I went up there and spent about 5 months there through the winter. I thought my mind a little bit off when I intuited that I should go there despite the winter, but somehow there was no snow and was relatively warm, so then everything sorted itself out. So yeah, very blessed to have been guided to go there. Maybe one of the most beautiful places to meditate, and the area is very Buddhist as well, so you always find good support. So yeah, it's a place that I would recommend everyone visit if they're interested in just kind of experiencing the Himalayas and meditating there. So a lot of caves and very powerful places.
Next stop, India.
Yeah, next stop, India. The visa expires as it always does, and so I'll go a little bit to Bodh Gaya, then maybe I'll meet with Delson up in Uttarakhand later on, and then after that, who knows, maybe I'll just do the same thing I did in Nepal and in the Indian Himalayas. So quite enjoy that lifestyle.
So you're a wandering monk in the tradition of the old mendicants.
I wouldn't really, in some ways yes, but I wouldn't really phrase myself in that way. I just find myself unable to find any teacher that can really help my mind, so then I find myself just having to do things on my own, and then intuitively figuring out as I go what the best means of development would be. And so sometimes then that's wandering, sometimes it's meditating in the middle of the city. Well, generally as a Theravada monk you shouldn't really do what I do, because you should find a teacher and be within the Sangha, but in my case I'm just unable to do that without repeatedly crashing, and so just kind of ended up doing this in this way. But definitely worthy of admonishment in some ways. So, but I have to live with that.
Thank you, Jina. Thank you very much. I'm curious, when we were sat back there on the bench in the first part, you closed your eyes, and then you said it's time to move location.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Oh, just intuition.
It was a moment of intuition.
Yeah.
Did you access it deliberately, or did it come to you spontaneously?
Just spontaneously. So here, the mind has two aspects in it. That is the rational mind, and there's the more feminine, creative, mysterious mind, the more magical mind. And you develop intuition when you start entering into the unknown, where your rational mind doesn't have any kind of thing to grasp on or try to reason with, and then you start to relax into that unknown, and instead of making it an anxious unknown, you make it into a mysterious sacred mystery. And if you make things as sacred mystery, then you start getting intuitions about things, about what to do and how to time things. But it's also very confusing to develop, because in the beginning you'll start doing things that doesn't make any sense until afterwards you see that it works.
What kind of things?
Like standing in a certain place, just kind of waiting until something happens, or like me going to the Himalayas in the middle of winter. Yeah, things like that. Coming. So life is sufficiently difficult that you need meaning to offset. You need meaning to justify the suffering. And so if you're on a spiritual path, then mere aspiration and longing for some kind of magical state of consciousness that will solve all of your problems is not enough. Because in that longing you'll also neglect and shy away from the hard work of purifying and ennobling character. So if you voluntarily take on the responsibility and burden of trying to emulate the heroes of the past and using those ideals as a pathway to grow on the individual level of character, and then at the same time aspiring for something like some magical state of consciousness that will solve all your problems, then you solve the problem of spiritual bypassing, and you also solve the problem of mistake, because as you're aiming for something ideal, then naturally it requires an act of courage in some sense, because you have to believe that maybe you can become that. And in some sense you may say that as delusional or foolish, but you don't have anything else. And in your attempt to try to aim towards any kind of ideal, be that Christ, be that the Buddha, or if you're Shaivite then it would be Shiva, then in that attempt, then you'll make a lot of mistakes, and you'll aim wrongly, and you will idealize too highly, and you'll shoehorn yourself into practices that maybe don't suit you. And in the end, that's maybe a good thing, because then you start to develop your own discernment and wisdom as to what is suitable for your particular mind. So without mistake, then there's no individual discernment of your particular blockages and faults and even skills. The more you become sensitive to mistake and learn from it, then you develop more and more skill in your own mind, mastery over traversing the path, and then you start to see more and more improvement as time goes on. Think about something like, it doesn't need to be much. The highest of ideals isn't that far away if you were to actually do the things that you know you ought to do and not do the things that you stupidly regret afterwards. If you were to simply go 2% a day of improvement, you shouldn't underestimate incremental growth. You should take advantage of the fact that you can aim pretty high, like maybe even for arahantship, maybe for sainthood, maybe for someone that could solve the fundamental problems of the world and be a disseminator of values and a disseminator of understanding. And if you aim like that, then you have something that motivates you. Well, you have a narrative for your life that would justify and make up for the worst of hardships. And you need that. Because if you only meditate for the sake of a magical state of consciousness that will solve all your problems, then you won't progress very far, because you're not accessing, say, the full force of motivation that lies within a human being. And for that you need great stories, great narratives.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.